Okay, so good afternoon or evening. I'm not quite sure what time it is. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the first of the Biennale's Carnival events, which is generously and additionally sponsored by Rolex. When I was first appointed curator, which now seems like a decade ago, not 15 months, two very strong visual connections between my world and this world popped into my head. The first was the Lion of Venice, and the second was the Carnival. As everybody knows, we subsumed the lion in our visual identity, and now we turn to the carnival. I've only been to one Venetian carnival, but I've been to many African and diasporan carnivals, including Europe's biggest in Notting Hill, which as a teenager in London was one of the first public events I'd been to that openly celebrated the spirit of diaspora. This Biennale is as much about the ties that bind us as the divisions we encounter. And as architects, we generally communicate our ideas and convictions through drawings, photographed texts, and various forms of digital media. But for the most part, our drawings and texts are hermetic, sealed languages understood by few outside the discipline. If architectural discourse aims to have a greater and more direct impact beyond its own boundaries, new and more generous and accessible forms of communication are required. So to support this ambition, my team and I have put forward a program of events during the Laboratory of the Future called Carnival. It offers a space in which words, views, perspectives, and opinions are traded, heard, analyzed, and remembered. Politicians, policymakers, poets, filmmakers, documentary makers, writers, activists, community organizers, and public intellectuals will share the stage with architects, academics, and students. And thus curating a public event program is increasingly a form of architectural practice that attempts to bridge the gulf between architects and the public. Carnival does not acknowledge any distinction between actors and spectators. Carnival is not a spectacle seen by the people, they live in it, and everyone participates because its very idea embraces all the people. While Carnival lasts, like the Biennale, there is no life outside it. During Carnival time, life is subject only to its own laws, that is, the laws of its own freedom. It has a universal spirit. It is a special condition of the entire world, of the world's revival and renewal, in which all take part, by Mikhail Bakhtin. So in that spirit, I am delighted to introduce 6 practitioners to open the Carnival season, all of whom are participants in the Force Majeure exhibition in the Central Pavilion. And when I wrote this text, I didn't realize what the seating arrangement was going to be, so bear with me. Walter Hood is a professor and former chair of landscape architecture at the University of California, Berkeley in the US. He is the principal of Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California, and in 2019 was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, commonly known as the Genius Grant. He established his studio in 1992, and his work ranges from local community-based projects to large-scale garden designs. He is often described as a community whisperer, creating spaces that have elements the residents want before they even know it. So welcome, Walter. Felicia Davis is an associate professor at Pennsylvania State University. She is the founding member of the Black Reconstruction Collective, a not-for-profit group of Black architects, scholars, and artists supporting and funding design work about the Black diaspora. Her work in computational textiles questions how we live, and she reimagines how we might use textiles in our daily lives and in architecture. Computational textiles are textiles that are responsive to cues in the environment, using sensors and microcontrollers, or textiles that use the changeable properties of the material itself to communicate information to people. In architecture, these responsive textiles are used in lightweight shelters and are transforming how we communicate, socialize, and use space. Welcome, Felicia. Thank you. So David Adjaye is a Ghanaian-British architect and the principal of Adjaye Associates with offices in Accra, London, and New York. His work is globally renowned with projects on almost every continent. He was knighted in 2017 for services to architecture and is the recipient of the 2021 Royal Gold Medal, making him the first African and one of the youngest recipients. He was appointed to the Order of Merit in 2022. He needs no further introduction. Welcome, David. Issa Diabate, to my left, am I right? Yes, is the Managing Director of Kofi Diabate Architects, with offices in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cotonou, Benin. He has led a number of local initiatives that deal with African urban issues and address context-oriented problems. As an architect practicing almost solely on the continent, he aims to shed light on important issues, as well as the creative solutions required to build the African city of tomorrow. As an aside, in 2019, he designed a chair for IKEA, which was launched at the Design Indaba conference in Cape Town. Welcome, Issa. Thank you. Mariam Issoufou Kamara is an architect from Niger, not Nigeria. Her designs focus on open living spaces and make use of locally produced materials available to African communities: cement, recycled metal, and raw earth. Her first career ambition was to become a computer engineer, for which she earned a bachelor's degree in technical computing in 2001, and then a master's degree in computer science. She worked in the computing field for 7 years before deciding to change careers. In 2018, she was selected in the Rolex Mentor and Protégé Awards and spent a year with Sir David in the career-defining program. And engineering's loss is architecture's gain, so welcome, Mariam. And last but not least by any means, Christian Benimana is the co-executive director and senior principal of Mass Design Group. Christian's projects include the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture and the Ellen DeGeneres campus of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. He was the founding director of the African Design Center, a field-based apprenticeship that is set to empower leaders who will design a more equitable, just, and sustainable world. So welcome, everyone. And very much in the spirit of Carnival, I hope this will be a lively and liberating exchange that moves between the personal, professional, public, private, and political, although not in that order or any order at all. So Christian, I'm going to begin with you. What was your first reaction to the invitation to take part in this Biennale?
The first reaction was fear, and I'll explain myself. I don't come from a background in which we are often allowed to be troublemakers, but I'm of a nature of being a troublemaker. So that kind of creates a sense of diplomatic day-to-day reaction or relationship to everything that we do. And then what allowed me to overcome that fear was rereading your first write-up of what this Biennale is going to be, especially on the exhibition which we're invited to be part of, and trying to understand what you're trying to achieve with that particular exhibition. And like reading it, I don't know, I must have read it for like 100 times, trying to read between the lines.
There was no reading between the lines, it was straight up.
It was straightforward, but I wanted to make sure that I get it correct. So that was my first reaction. And then I felt like as we started working on this project, I felt liberated.
That's great, thank you. Mariam, you have always said that process is your natural design medium, the way you approach design. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, I think it's because ultimately for me, the process and what we do as we go about designing a project of architecture is as important as the building that comes, at least for me, afterwards. The building is not necessarily the destination or final destination. the whole process is equally important. And also the process of what happens to the building afterwards is incredibly important and crucial to consider as you're conceiving of it. So it is always central to our practice in that way, and it takes various forms always, and it's always a multi-layered sort of practice.
And is every process the same, or does each project birth a new process? I mean, in other words, do you have a particular methodology?
I would say that the process is more or less the same. The surprises along the way are really the key. So the way that we will approach it, the tools, are the same. And then you get veered off course by those little surprises, these unexpected, elements that you unearth in the process, as you're working through it. And those are the things that end up becoming the real elements that make the final building.
And do you have any examples of surprises that have led to certain design decisions?
Goodness, so many, because a lot of them, I would say, come through the process of not necessarily, doing orthodox research, like going through archival information, or anything of that nature. It comes to speaking to people. And that changes the nature of projects very often. I would say that has happened to at least half of the projects we've built, where we would set out to make a certain type of project, but then the program specifically would get altered through these conversations. And that is something, even when we speak with clients, people who commission the project, that there's always sort of that caveat or that kind of forewarning, or that question of whether there's an openness for the program and the objectives of the project to slightly veer, of course, to make something that actually fulfills the ultimate goal of the project much better. And that comes through these discussions with communities, through different various exercises and workshops. And it's not really about architecture, those conversations. They're about bigger things. They are about, their todays, they're about their yesterdays, they're about the way in which they want to project themselves in the future. They're about their hopes and desires. And those things tell you so much about what the spaces need to do for them.
David and Issa, I'm going to ask you both the same question, and you can fight between you who's going to answer it first. But you represent two major poles in Africa, the Anglophone and Francophone worlds. Does this division have any impact on your approach to design? In other words, does your work transcend these cultural divides?
That's a great question, and really sets up the sort of complicated history of the continent, really. And really, we're talking about the history of technologies, in a way, I guess, and the way in which technologies have been brought to the continent in terms of the built environment, and what those histories are, and how we use those histories, and then how, I know my practice, and I know Issa's practice a little bit, a huge fan, find ways of implementing them through the lens of our agenda of trying to make an architecture that really starts to engage with a future, engage with the theme, engage with the idea of making a future. So for me, there is no division, but there is a kind of bias because I live in an Anglophone world, and so the technologies I receive are Anglophone technologies. So it's through the lens of an Anglophone modernity lens. But my references and the things and the way in which I look at the way in which the continent's built really goes across it. For me, I'm just as fascinated by some of the extraordinary work that's happening in the Francophone world. And for me, some of the work that has happened in the Francophone world are incredibly powerful benchmarks about the possibilities of upscaling certain sort of local conditions into metropolitan conditions, which are very, very precious. And I think Ivory Coast is a great example.
I mean, just before you jump in, I just kind of want to bring in the idea that for much of the Anglophone world at independence, most Anglophone African countries really thought that science and technology would be the drivers of the future. And I think for Francophone countries, there was a greater investment in the arts, in the humanities, let's say. So I'm just kind of interested to see how that plays out in your work.
Well, what I find interesting is, for instance, yesterday I was at the Tropical Modernism exhibition, And I also see it in terms of periods. When you look at that period, from the 60s to the 80s, you can see a very similar DNA, between Anglophone and Francophone countries. That sort of changed afterwards. I don't know exactly why, but there certainly is a slight variation in the approaches. But what I find extraordinary are the challenges when you're looking at, you go from Accra to Nairobi to Abidjan, and you look at the peripheries of our cities, and they're very similar. They have a very similar DNA, which sort of brings me back to the idea that we have a common challenge to pretty much fight for. And I think it's a wonderful occasion, especially here at the Biennale, to be able to share what we do, what others do, and how we can each benefit from everybody's process.
Felicia, you're both an architect and an engineer. So how is this professional duality expressed in your work? Has it been a route into your exploration specifically of black space?
Yes, actually, engineering and architecture are intertwined always. And I would say throughout my career, this has been something that I've been working on to weave together. In terms of the work that we've been doing in the office now, it's really looking at woven, knitted, embroidered, fibrous work that can be embedded with other technologies, or also using the natural properties of things to really communicate with people. So one can look at that from the point of view of clothing, right, at kind of very small scale, at the scale of the body, or up in scale to the scale of a shelter, a shade shelter, or an emergency tent, for example. So I think that in terms of connecting engineering and architecture together, I think more and more this is going to be embedded in imagining architecture. There are technologies that are, in fact, permeating how we make architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And if architects do not have kind of control over these tools, they will not be able to project their dreams and sort of project their way forward in the world. So I think that it's important to architects to look at these tools. And so I believe that there will be, in fact, some more engineering and architecture and more architecture and engineering. So there will be, I think, a mashup.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is probably a really alien conversation to maybe have here, but I think that often these tools go unnoticed and kind of deep sixed into how we actually make architecture, but in fact, it ultimately guide and shape what actually ends up being the spaces that we inhabit and live in.
It's interesting, as a student of architecture myself, maybe 30 years ago, trying to find a way to express ideas around race and identity. In architecture, I was constantly told to go to other disciplines. So I could go to music or to literature or, God forbid, fashion. But I don't know that anyone would have ever said engineering. So it's interesting that you found a way in engineering to talk about material properties. I mean, your piece entitled Dreadlock, it's got such resonance with a particular hair texture. And it's interesting that you find in the engineering discipline the kind of freedom to explore something that maybe in architecture has been curtailed.
I think so. I think engineering sometimes does have a kind of broader scope, or a way to allow you to have a kind of liberation from cultural expectations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that was one thing about engineering that's very liberating, and finding, looking at, for example, fibrous architectures really helps one to think in a kind of larger scope, not really disciplinary, but rather kind of interwoven and intermeshed.
Mm-hmm. I love that word, mashup. It's great. So, Walter, when I read that you're often described as a community whisperer, I felt my spirit lift a little. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you've been described that way?
It's you get described one way and it follows you for the rest of your life.
So sorry.
No, this came out of a project we worked on in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Hill District, which is a 1,000-acre post-industrial landscape that you know very well, Felicia, you're working in. And I was hired by the Parks Department to basically make a master plan. And I went there and I found that people have been living in this landscape for the last 50 years unfettered by its condition. And its condition, it had become a woodland, and everyone wanted to change this woodland, and they wanted to get rid of the black locust, you know, the successional landscape that had come up because people had departed the landscape. And so we created a process where we didn't design, we just held meetings, and I listened to people. And once I listened to them, instead of giving them what they wanted, I heard different things that was connecting them to a place. And so when it came time to like show the final project, we said, well, there's no plan. The plan is already here. And because they had been telling me that how they walk through the neighborhood. And so we made a trail, an impromptu trail through the neighborhood that reinforced where they were already walking. And then we tied it to a history. In the history of extracting coal. And I told them what they were walking on was a bench where they had extracted coal from. And they immediately was like, he heard us, but he also was telling us, taking us on this journey on the way. And so that kind of stuck to a certain degree, but it allowed us to really think about when we work in different communities to really listen. And it is really hard to listen. I mean, it requires, I mean, really, it's hard to listen because, in a way, our brains we're so loud inside. And it really, each project to me, it gives me a kind of a discipline where I just have to figure out ways to listen.
And to retreat. I mean, there's something, I know I've said it before, but there's a term in archaeology, I think it's called argument from silence, and it means in archaeology that if you dig somewhere and you don't find anything, it doesn't mean that nothing was there.
Yes, yes.
And I think there's a lot of, I guess, qualities of excavating something that you know instinctively is there, but you don't quite have the right tools or vocabulary to express it. And what's amazing about, I guess, architecture and its related disciplines is that it gives you the tools to construct that.
No, while I was in the academy in Rome, you know, I had never really traveled, and we would do these tours from Turkey all the way around the Horn, and we went to Carthage once, you know, and there was nothing really to see, and all the architects were like, oh, there's nothing here. But the archaeologist was like, we know. We know. We know, you know, Noikonoshi. And they were like, I was like, what do you know? But they were talking about this place as if they saw something. And it intrigued me. And like, we would only go on digs if there was stuff. So I started going on digs where there was nothing. And it was a very keen insight because the landscape bears these traces if you look really, really close, right? And so it came out really out of that. And it's something that when I go to a place now, you have to listen in a way, but it's not listening through ears. It's like
listening in another sense, It makes me think that to be really targeted and intentional about these questions around identity, race, power, maybe there are disciplinary combinations like archaeology that are prerequisites for anyone entering into this field.
Yeah, it bothers me that in landscape architecture, which is one of my disciplines, we dig a lot. But we dig for like irrigation. We dig to change the grades. But in that dirt, we're moving it, and it's as if that life in the dirt means nothing. And after a while, I was like, just the process of removing in a site, we're now very keen to say, well, maybe let's leave some things so that people can have their ear to the ground as well. But that's a very difficult
conversation.
conversation.
Also to do with the value of land and X, Y, Z, So I'm going to open the conversation a little bit more broadly, and as I've said to everybody on the panel, I'm going to ask a question, and if you really feel like answering it, just nod or raise your finger. So this is going to be a really easy question. What does this gathering mean to you? I thought it was going to be easy.
I just think it's, I'll break the silence.
It's a cheap shot, sorry.
It's a good one. No, I think that there's a radicality in gathering, I think. And I think that as communities of color, we don't gather enough, actually. And I think we don't gather enough, especially in the diaspora, because of the conditions of that position. And I think that gathering allows us to see each other and allows us to understand our scales and to understand a kind of relationship which stops you being the other, you know? And that kind of neutralizing of the other really creates a space of, you know, community and communion, which I think can foster a kind of much greater ability to kind of negotiate and be in the world. So for me, it's a radical act. Yeah. I'm happy to follow. For me, this gathering means that we have an opportunity not only to ask questions differently, but to choose how we ask the questions. I will elaborate on that a little bit. There've been, I think, all of us here on the stage, we work in fields in which we are trusted to be solution seekers and finders. And that type of work comes with the territory that we have to know how to ask the questions. But what I find in my small experiences working for the past 10, 13 years is that I didn't realize how inadequate my languages, the mediums I was using in asking the questions, even the identity from which I was asking this question was not fit for the purpose. And what I mean is this, is that when we talk about these big global challenges, we talk about like climate change and social inequities and extreme poverty and all these sort of things, I think most of us are conditioned to think about them through certain lenses that are cultural, that are scientific. Unfortunately, the majority of our communities are not participating in this simply because of the lack of the confusion of these cultural identities that we talk about. And therefore, we don't ask the right questions. I was having conversation with some of my colleagues and I was telling them that the problem with climate change is that it has turned into a debate about data, scientific data. And we never talk about how, as a problem, it's a geopolitical, structural, cultural problems in which the majority of communities in the world live in a setup in which the only outcome that we receive are the consequences of the lifestyle we carry. And there's a minority of communities in this world that reap all the benefits. Like, that is the danger of climate change. The climate change is, we still have a number of years to live before everything blows up. And even if it blows up, certain people might leave. They might go with Elon Musk to Mars and they'll survive, I don't know. But that's not the real question. The real question is, can we sustain a system in which there are communities that are not receiving equal participation in what we call life? And if we ask those questions differently and try to find answers differently, then there's a chance that then we are speaking the same language. Otherwise, we'll keep chasing the answers to the wrong questions.
I'm going to build on that because I was going to say, to me, this gathering meant the kind of building of a connective tissue to really kind of stitch and sew things that haven't really been explored or even seen, but now raised to public eye. People are like, wow, that's there. seeing something that has always been there but hasn't really been seen. So I see this gathering is a making of the opportunity to see something that hasn't been seen yet, and making of connective tissue to understand questions in a different way. The questions that we want to ask and the problems that we need to solve are very complex. And I don't think that, I think for a long time, I agree with you, that we have not included everybody at the table to understand the complexity. So
I was in the cafe at the Biennale headquarters this morning, just before the the award ceremony, and there was a young black woman who was standing at the counter waiting to be served, and for whatever reason she was ignored, and she broke down, and she repeatedly asked the lady on the other side of the counter, "Do you see me?" And the lady thought she meant, like, literally, "Do I see you?" And she said, "Of course I see you." But that wasn't the question she was asking. And somehow in her voice, I recognized 300 years of asking the question, "Do you see me?" which was completely invisible to the person on the other side, who was just like, "Do you want to pay or do you not want to pay?" And it was a really, it was a powerful moment, yeah.
I mean, building on that, I would add it's more personal to me. It's more of liberation. And what I mean by that, to be in a space where I can just be and seeing others being themselves. Because, being in the US and other places, we have to conform a lot of the times, right? Because of who's, right, who's next to you. And when I walked into the show and to see your work, for you being next to me, it was really liberating in a way that I can't even explain right now. To just be able to walk around without that criticality that normally is there, and you can just walk from space to space, not out at the cafe, but inside the space, and to just exist as a collective and be okay that you're different than I am, because we're always lumped. It's like, I have to be like you, right? And that liberation to not have to,
Be like,
right?
yeah.
Be like is, thank you. I just want to thank you. Yeah.
I think there's something actually quite interesting in what you just said. Do you see me? My feeling about this Biennale is actually we no longer need to be seen by other people. What is quite beautiful is that all of a sudden we see each other. And I think that's a big... It's a big turning point, because we no longer need any kind of validation from the authority. And I think that is extremely beautiful, the fact that we are going back to the roots of interrogating where are we going, what do we want. And it's also very moving to see all the work of the younger generation. I think that is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And I wasn't necessarily expecting that coming here, but I'm certainly happy to have been experiencing that.
They're nipping at your heels, yeah. I mean, that leads me in a way to another question, which I think is important on the back of it. Does it bother you that we're meeting in Europe to discuss these issues? How might the discussion be different if it were on the continent?
So actually, for me, that's what I've been reflecting on more. When you ask the question, what does this gathering mean to you? I realized that I wasn't necessarily thinking about us as much, because we sort of understand what we're all trying to say. We know. So it's nice to have the confirmation of it. It's nice to all be together and to sort of see how each of us is treating this question. But I've been wondering a lot about what this means for here, what the impact is. Earlier, I was in another panel when we were discussing what this means, for example, in terms of education, what this means in terms of how you view yourself out there in the world. Because we know how we feel about how the rest of the world perceives us. But I think there's actually this other side of the coin, is how the world sees itself in relationship to us. And this gathering, for me, goes a long way towards starting to course correct some of that, because there is that inherent sort of superiority complex that permeates everything and is everywhere. It's not just about architecture, it's about the actual existence of these kinds of institutions or these kinds of programs that are self-referencing and see only their own image in it. And for us being here and this gathering, of all of us being there, it's almost a sort of a mirror image back at a world that has only been about itself. And that now, just let's say half of the program is coming from the continent. That's not even close to what it used to be in terms of how Europe was self-referencing itself, right? In this stage where you're thinking 100%, versus 50%. And that 50% that we're seeing now feels like a lot, but it's not, actually. And so for me, I've just really been thinking about what this means for this part of the world, to have this kind of gathering, to be in contact with it, but also for us to stand confidently in this space, because we have a lot to say and we have a lot to offer, and there's a lot of value in the practices we have, and a lot of value that are useful for this world. That's what it means for me.
So, I mean, what I find interesting is that there's a lot of passion and energy put into being here, and there's also a lot of energy and resources involved in hosting this. But the question that's constantly coming at me is that what does this have to do with anybody back home on the continent? And so I just wonder about that relationship between here and there, that we are here in this space having these conversations, somehow explaining ourselves to the rest of the world, but also explaining ourselves to each other. But at, in inverted commas, home, it's as if this never happened. Yeah. That's not really a question. So much has been said about the Black Atlantic as a driving cultural force. And maybe just to explain that statement a little bit to the audience, the historian and political scientist Paul Gilroy described the Black Atlantic as this kind of para-national identity. It's a space between Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, South America that's connected by a kind of common history. But in music, I think it's really easy to trace the kind of roots of how this culture has translated its experience into a certain genre. In architecture, I think it's very, very subliminated. So I just wondered what you think about it, because in this exhibition, the context of the diaspora has been super important.
I think it definitely is sublimated. It's easy to see these influences in food and in music. If you look to the food, kind of foodways in the United States, you can see, rice is coming from Africa across the sea, being planted in the plantations in the South, and the cuisines. So that is there. But in architecture, these, I guess you could say, cultural influences are sublimated and need to be, or are really being made anew through the imagination, I would say, through kind of understanding history, understanding archives, and then reinventing what could be, right? And so I think you see lots of the work in the exhibit, such as Lake's work, really start to do that, looking at the music, looking at the kind of cultural influences in Africa. But I think it's not so easy to find in architecture, right? It's totally sublimated.
Yeah. I remember being in Cabo Verde with my students maybe 3 or 4 years ago, probably more. And Cabo Verde is one of those countries where its diaspora is bigger than its internal community. And there's something called the Hora di Bye Bye in the airport, which is when people say goodbye to each other. So the departure area is very different in the airport in Cabo Verde, because there's a ritual that's played out. So somebody leaves and everybody shouts, don't go, and then they come back and they're given a little gift and then they go, don't go. And there's something about the space, the program of an airport that has been totally transformed by the culture of the diaspora. And I was just wondering, I mean, are there instances in your work practice that draw on this diaspora?
I would say through the idea of invention, really, learning through archives, learning through history, really, in our case, looking at African fabrics, for example, was something that we did a long time ago in work. But I think that, I don't know, I think, Leslie, you've given me something to ponder on. I'm not quite sure.
It makes me think of where I've been working in South Carolina along the East Coast, the Gullah Coast, and language has become something that I've become very interested in, particularly working with Gullah, and not the different dialects, but the use of English in a different way. And in my exhibit, I used the term the overgrown, right? This is the thing, and it just came out of someone saying, I let the overgrown take care of it. And if you weren't listening, you wouldn't have gotten what they were talking about. And what they were talking about was living in a landscape, right? A landscape that's constantly growing and that has that connection, right, to another place. And for them, that landscape is always about something overgrown, which is bigger than them. And when I heard that, I said, can you repeat it? And he says, what do you mean? I said, you said something. He says, the overgrown? I was like, yeah, that's it.
The word, yeah.
And so this became a way, and so now I'm always looking for those smaller things, and particularly within these communities because they have not been intertwined completely within the American geography.
Yeah.
And so it's places like that, and even on the West Coast, we don't think of the Pacific, and there's a new history of blacks in California. Yeah? Blacks in California, and it's another thing that they were part of the gold rush and things like that, which we don't talk about.
I think there are lots of practices in the United States that we see that are, as you described, spaces in the airport. Practicing, I'm thinking about Sekou Cook's work with rap, and the kind of appropriation of the street and dance and kind of bringing that culture out into a larger space and kind of, the kind of larger idea of a block party and in a community and what that means for a community gathering and connecting together. So I think these things that we're talking about in terms of architecture are expansive and are present and visible through practices, rather than, I would say, necessarily actual kind of form. And that the form, at least in the United States, is something that and you see the younger generation inventing and making anew.
I mean, it's very striking for me that when we were thinking, or when I was thinking about the title, The Laboratory of the Future, there was a kind of ambivalence about the word laboratory because it wasn't exactly what I meant, and workshop wasn't exactly what I meant. And at the end, I thought there is not yet an architectural space for what this is. And maybe that is the same relationship to a kind of diasporic or a hybrid identity, that the architectural form has not yet been invented that fits it somehow or that expresses it.
And a lot of times it's not really about form. For instance, doing residential work in West Africa is quite particular. I mean, you can see a building that looks like any other building. But when you start looking at the plan, the way things are organized, you realize that it's very specific to where it is. For instance, where do you put, I would say in a West African house, the service quarters. That's very important in terms of the way the house is organized, because if you mess up with that, I mean, you mess up with the whole house. So it's not necessarily visible. I mean, how do you treat, for instance, cross-ventilation is something that sometimes seems to be completely transparent to the person who looks at the building. But if you sort of get a little bit closer, you can understand how that building is related to all the history of building, pre-colonial building, where pretty much people exactly knew how to deal with their own climate.
I mean, it doesn't excite, but I remember my father, when he first came to visit the house that I built in Accra, which is it's a single room space, he was at first very shocked, like, where's the bedroom, where's the kitchen, where's the living room, why is this just one space? And after some time, we were chatting about, in many African cultures, the greeting is hugely important. How's your mother, how's your father, how's the family, goes through a whole thing. And he said to me, in a typical West African house, maybe the hallway would be the biggest room in the house, because that's where all of the ritual around greeting takes place. And it was very interesting to see him as a surgeon suddenly click that there is a relationship between the space and the thing that goes in it, or things that go on in it. So I've got a couple more questions, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. But what do you think others, so Europeans in the global north, ought to understand about this exhibition? What change would you like to see? Can I start with you, David?
Gosh, I mean, I think from what you were saying to where you are now, I think that fundamentally one of the things that I think that's becoming very apparent is that there is a very clear need for another body of knowledge to intersect and to co-curate the environment. It's just not enough. And I get, for me, the show is overwhelmingly a statement about searching for other knowledge systems, really, and looking for spaces, whether it's in the roots or in the symbolic, the profoundly symbolic, even the symbolic which has been eradicated, but the memory of it that's still present in all our bodies still somehow cries. And I just think if we're talking about a world where we're interested in the way in which humanity kind of expresses itself, the 21st century is the century of, even though there's so much resistance, it is the century of immense human explosion and an immense human entanglement. We're in the century of entanglement.
Yeah.
So we've got to learn how to share knowledge and to respect knowledge and to understand how knowledge produces different forms of life and urbanism and custom and culture, and they are all absolutely critical for our own collective intelligence as human beings. I mean, to be so sort of large about it. So for me, I just think it's just really a time to be very confident about other knowledge systems and to not to shy away from it. And I don't think, I'm always sad when Black culture feels that it has to just be about its, what I call hidden forms, the backyard. Like, why do we always have to celebrate the backyard? I love the backyard. But can't we also celebrate our presence, our gathering, our symbolism? For me, I'm interested very much in the expansion. And it's not a threat or it's a competition. It's really about using that as a way to kind of look at other ways. For me, Demos was really brilliant just in the past few days, and he talked about the loss of dancing in the urbanization of our cities to the idea that only, youth dance in clubs, but actually dancing is a great way of actually communicating too. And it's not about the formality of dancing, but the act of moving your body. I thought that was just so powerful, the way he was, and talking about that radicality. And that is so African. If an event happened in Africa, this event, there'd be dancers everywhere.
Yeah, I think the South Africans took over Cardiff the other day.
And it was just so brilliant. It's like, oh God, yeah. The energy changes. Yeah. And I think that's beautiful. That's to share, yeah.
I think to piggyback on that, and then on what you were saying, and Isa, also what you were alluding to with the organization of a home, for example, it feels that we're also at a point where perhaps we don't need to make do. It's sort of time to not be satisfied with having a model that is there, that somehow, we need to prove that we mastered that model, number one. And number two, that even when we have other realities, that we just become ingenious about knowing how to use that model to accommodate the real realities. I like to think that we're way past that now, or we can be past that. We're ready to be past that. And to actually allow, in the case of architecture, the spaces to take the shape they need to take. So your father's comment, I think, is so brilliant in this idea that maybe the hallway needs to be, the biggest area. Why wouldn't the hallway? Why can't the hallway be the biggest area?
Or in African culture, the hallway is the court.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
the yard. It's
Exactly.
the courtyard in the center.
Yeah.
We don't
Yes.
have hallways.
Exactly.
We have rooms and courts.
And how these spaces already exist. They existed before the kind of tabula rasa process, right? Where you have the process of greeting and gathering. There's so many different steps to that. There's what happens in front of your house. Then you have the anti-chamber that you enter in. There's another type of greeting, entertaining that happens. And then you move on to a larger courtyard, et cetera, et cetera. Why is it that we need to justify, these behaviors and sort of try to fit them into this new mold rather than imagining actually new ways, 21st century ways that, shapes that they can take, how to move those things forward?
But I think that's very much part of what your work does. I mean, I always say that we talked about this, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, that the African architect is always involved in mission creep. You start out thinking, I'm designing a building, and then you become a developer and a financer and a bricklayer and then a cement maker, and then it just goes on and on and on. But actually, maybe the fundamental is that, if the developer has the kind of majority power of what goes on in the city, it's the developer who needs to be re-educated. Yeah, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think of a story I often tell is that a few years ago, I was leading a group of young architects to do some urban proposal for sort of informal neighborhood from the outside. And we go in there, and the first thing we do is talk to the people, and they're like, oh, what are you doing here? And we're like, oh, well, we just came to, quote unquote, fix your place. And they look at us, and they're like, well, you guys cannot build for us. Do you know that? And as architects, of course, we were quite surprised. And the second thing they say is, you cannot build for us because you don't know our culture, you don't know our sociology, you don't know our means, and you don't know how we live, basically. And what they were actually saying is, we didn't call you. And of course, we understood that a little bit later on when we went inside and realized that they were already organized, that the social structure was very strong, and you had chiefs and chiefs associations and women's associations and young people doing compost, doing urban agriculture. And they tell us, actually, your role is not to come and build for us. Your role is to be a link between us and the state, to provide us with good water, with electricity, with sewage, with water treatment, but not to build. And that actually talks to the new role of the architect that we have to pretty much face, which is no longer about building the next nice building, but is actually some kind of architecture that we have to do with the society in general.
So I've got one more question, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. But is there anything missing from this exhibition? Are there topics that you would have liked to see included, or areas that were left out that you think should be there? Feel free.
Capital. Capital, by capital I mean money. I'm going to be very blunt. I think as much as as many panelists have said, we no longer question the adequacy of our cultures, our ability to be innovative in architecture, in creating frameworks in which we understand our cultural identities and everything. I think we're comfortable doing that. We have a body of knowledge and talent that both on the continent and diaspora and in the African American professionals that are dedicated to this and we're getting traction. I think we're reaching a comfortable place than we were half a century ago, 100 years ago. However, and I have to say this here today, we operate in a financial system that is so unfair that the opportunities that are given for us to be able to achieve this requires so much efforts that very few people are able to realize their potential in this body of work. And until this changes, what I worry about is not the people on this panel, because many people have fought, went through against the system and have have survived and are here now talking to the rest of the people in this audience. But what I worry is the loss of talent. People that are very innovative, very brilliantly intelligent, that can contribute to this meaningfully, that just give up. Just give up because it's so hard. It's so hard, and we've normalized that hardship. Yeah. And I find that very unsettling for me. Yeah. And so I think until we talk about that, until we have that conversation, that building in Africa is not cheap. I'm sorry, it's not cheap. I not agree to that, because that suggests that there is a continent in which lives are worth much less than anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And that it doesn't work for me, I'm sorry, it doesn't. So I think for me, one missing big component is, I don't know, maybe it's there and I haven't seen it, because I also can't claim that I've seen everything intimately, because it's a big exhibition. I'm gonna come back for every opportunity I get. But I think until we talk about how value is created and defined in this world, we still have a big gap to fill.
Well said, well said. One thing to add to that, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of underdevelopment, right? Particularly through variables, this idea that, particularly in the US, we've gotten comfortable with our communities being underdeveloped. And I mean in a way that, in post-war, certain communities were subsidized. We were given the same thing, but we weren't subsidized. And we were allowed to crumble while they flourished. Our schools, all of these things, we're living in these places that are underdeveloped. And when we want the capital to go in to talk about this development, we talk about it in a different way. But if we see it as this idea of these are rational decisions to underdevelop places so that people will stay underdeveloped. And it's a vicious cycle that you see. And so you literally see our communities dying because of this. And I think it would be interesting to have that larger conversation, and particularly in America with integration, this idea, that during segregation, a lot of these things that you're talking about, they existed. I mean, I lived in the hallway, right? I mean, in the house, because it was 700 square feet. But now we want 8 bedrooms, but we've left those communities, and now they're living in tough sheds, right? Not 700 square foot houses. And that idea, and that's not by coincidence, right? And so that's another layer.
I mean, I think it should be publicly said as well that the sort of heavy lift of this exhibition was made possible actually by largely African-American philanthropy. And so, the big donors aside, Bloomberg Philanthropies and Rolex, the two people who came to the table were Mellon and Ford, which are both headed by African-Americans. And for me, that's a classic example of the diaspora coming, not so much to the rescue, but coming to the rightful place of interconnectedness. And I think that wouldn't have happened otherwise, yeah. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to open this up for a couple of minutes. I'm not quite sure how we are doing on time. I haven't got a watch on me. We've got 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a really inspiring Biennale. Given everything you've said in the last hour, is it time to kill the Venice Architecture Biennale? Hopefully I'll make it out safely.
My esteemed panel, would you like to take that? I'm happy to, but
I'll jump in.
go on.
I would say absolutely not. It's a moment of connection, but perhaps there could be other structures in place to allow the connections to be deeper and further, to allow other voices to be heard.
I think it's really a moment of reconstruction of the Venice Biennale.
Yeah. Yeah, I would second that in an instant, yeah.
I would say that the decolonization, decarbonization does not end with Africa. So there's still a long way to go. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the conversation. You guys mentioned about this gathering neutralizing the other, and it reminded me of Professor Locko's interview where she talked about the culture of architecture practice versus the tradition of pedagogy, and how you sort of entered from a place of being othered. So I was wondering, and in theme of the laboratory of the future, what are your aspirations for this Biennale in relation to pedagogy? Or in other words, what do you want my generation, who are the students, the future practitioners, future academics, what do you want us to take away from this Biennale? Thank you.
You know, when I thought about the category for emerging and younger practitioners, there was a lot of ambivalence about the term guests from the future, because the word guest implies that you need a host, that you have to be invited to something. But the more I thought about the term and the span, the kind of lifespan of not just an exhibition, but the things that follow it, my hope is that this generation will very soon become the hosts. And I think that relationship between a kind of tentative exploration of something that you now suddenly have a platform to occupy, and then taking agency and ownership of the material, that happens in a generation. And I think education is always a long game. It's a minimum 2-generation project. For the young practitioners here, or the young architects, spatial practitioners, to think about how you design your own form of practice, I think is a really important step. If there's anything that I wish the guests to take away, it's that. Yeah, thank you. So there was somebody in the back, yeah. Wiladi? Yeah.
Thank you. Leslie, your curation very much strikes me to be intentionally about the architectural process. So more of a focus, more that than the focus on the final piece or final building, for example, which brings a wealth of layering and complexity that is confronting and powerful in a way I've never experienced in the Venice Biennale before, taking space and waiting for space to be given. At this inflection point, what I hope is an inflection point, in designing what our future practices could look like, I'm curious to understand where you as a panel hope we practitioners will direct our energy over the next 5, 10, 15 years. What are the most urgent topics and discourse we must focus on now?
I cannot claim to know what all the topics are that we should tackle, but I think one of them that is staring us in the face is part of this Biennale, this issue of how we deal with climate change, obviously, what our responsibility is as practitioners, really leaning into the idea, or rather the fact, that we are one of the major culprits of what has happened to the planet, and to take that incredibly seriously rather than just something that requires a quick band-aid real quick, that we use yet more technology to, consume a bit less fossil fuel rather than and use solar, energy instead, et cetera, which are all other types of bandages. But start thinking as space makers how we can actually learn, or rather re-excavate a lot of the wisdom that we already had on how to live comfortably in climate, how our environments deal with the climate rather than relying on artificial ways of inhabiting. And I think sort of this point of being able to create, again, going back to the notion of hybridities, being able to reach back out to the forgotten wisdoms and find ways to combine them with the technological advances, with sort of the condition of being kind of creatures of the 21st century, is really sort of where we need to go in order not to, I mean, what we've done is already irreparable, but perhaps start exploring ways in which we can start also undoing some of the damage and how we can build more responsibly moving forward. But then the second point I wanted to make was, again, about what the Biennale was addressing, is this idea of plurality of voices, which is incredibly important, I believe, in architecture, considering that there has been sort of this totalitarian approach to architecture that can only look one way, where modernity can only look a very singular way. There's a very sort of small, narrow view of what architecture represents as a practice, but also as a product at the end of it on the other hand. And I think at this point we clearly understand that it doesn't need to be that way, and that it's actually incredibly harmful to the environment, but also harmful to us as human beings. And and it impoverishes us as human beings to have this one-point perspective of how things need to operate and be, and having these system of knowledges that are so much more multidimensional, so much more pluralistic, to, as a collective, as humans, actually start solving our problems collectively.
I just hope that you don't go home and this becomes a Pinterest page, right? I mean, now I can pull this up for inspiration. I would hope that you go home and look around the places where you are and you figure out how to practice, right? You figure out your own way to make a practice, because it is that whether plurality, it's that diversity we need in those places. And that's really hard to do. You can't just put the shingle up. You have to figure out what it is you want to say in the world through the medium. And it's very difficult. And I think that to me was, once I got to that place where I figured it out for myself, I could then practice. And I think we look too much around. And I think if we are really true and we can go back to your place where you are and look around, because you will see the issues. It's not one thing. It's not just water rising. Go to your house. You will see the issues: poverty, education, all of these things, they exist. And that's something that I hope we can begin to talk more about within the academic and within the profession. Yeah.
I really hope I can follow that. I think be sober about the purpose of why you practice. I've said this to a number of people that I could, that architecture for me is such a powerful art form and creative process. When we set its purpose to make beautiful buildings, we can make prisons beautiful. We can make anything. We've actually done it in the past. We've deployed architecture in such harmful ways, and it was still beautiful architecture. So I think for me, if there was one area that I would recommend that people studying architecture at the moment, and maybe younger professionals focus on, is how to, before starting practice, setting the purpose of that practice. And one recommendation I'll have would to question the use of the spaces we create, before we invest in the creative process of architecture that makes it all these beautiful, inspiring spaces that we are very capable of doing as architects, I think we need to question the purpose of which we are setting them up, because like our lives have changed from 500 years ago. We have tools that allows us to optimize our times. I read somewhere someone making an argument that now they no longer confirm to the 24 hours in a day, that then they have 3 days in 24 hours because their productivities can be 5 times than it was 100 years ago. And these are intriguing questions because I think the idea that we will live in a world where every young, aspiring person that wants to prosper wants to own 6 apartments in different cities around the world is unattainable. I don't think it's reasonable for us to continue holding those ideals in mind. And I think questioning why we're going to invest that architectural creativity and power into space making, I think needs to come at the forefront.
So I remember having a conversation with David in Johannesburg maybe 5 years ago, and I think you said we're not just in the business of building buildings, we're in the business of building knowledge. There's another aspect to this conversation which is also about building confidence. And the more confident you are, the less, in a sense, vulnerable you are, the more agency you have. And so the kind of trap that you talk about, that, you know, to become an architect is to prosper, to own 6 apartments, to travel, all of those kind of aspirations come, I think, out of a sense of insecurity. And so if you took really seriously the idea that architecture is about knowledge, about buildings, about environment, about confidence, I think it would change. So I'm going to, David, one more thing, and then one question, and then I think, oh my God, there's like 7 hands. All right, sorry. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that if you have to remove the sort of hyper-capitalism, which I think the last 30 years has kind of implicated us all in a kind of an architecture. To be an architect is to be a profession, to be a certain class in society. And I think that we have to understand that architecture is about enabling humanity to have dignity in the density of the world that is being made, and that actually profound architecture moves towards where the biggest problems are. And I think the title and the agency that I hope the next generation really should see from this biennial is that Africa needs to be rebuilt. It's not a joke, it needs to be rebuilt. And the generations of minds that are out there need to put their minds onto this thing. It's urgent. It is one of the fastest growing populations on the planet and the most underdeveloped. We have thousands of architects where they're not needed, just making money for people, and we have no architects on the continent. It's time to change the paradigm.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 questions because we have an exhausted panel. So whoever puts up their hand the fastest. So I've got one guy down there.
Thank you so much for the thought-provoking panel. Leslie, this is more for you than for the rest of the panel. I understand one of the themes, at least of the biennial, around decolonization. But having listened both to your opening statement at the press conference as well as what's coming out in this panel, I obviously understand the intention of decolonization. But having done all this, listening to all of you, it feels like it isn't what you mean. And the question is, what was the thinking around decolonization as a word, as a concept, that centers colonization? It's interesting to me that this entire conversation is about not centering Europe, not centering this entire period, but when we talk about it thematically, we then leave colonization at the very center of the room, and not talking about potentially Africanization, talking about something else. But it's concerning in a sense that we talk about decolonization.
I mean, I suppose for me, the big realization came when I moved to South Africa, and people were talking about a colonial paradigm. And I grew up in Ghana, which was always regarded as a colony. But the relationship between Ghana and Europe was a very different relationship to Europe to South Africa. And I realized that certainly in English, and maybe to a certain extent in French, there is a difference between a dominion and a colony. And we never speak about those differences. And a dominion, you know, the root of the word is domicile. You come to settle. We talk about a settler culture. And it seemed to me that we were talking about these issues of territory, of language, of belonging that were really about a dominion. You know, a colonial situation was an extractive situation. It was you come, you take, you go. And because in English we didn't really recognize the term dominion, actually what we are really talking about is de-dominionizing, not decolonizing. But that word is not as familiar. So the hope in this exhibition was that by privileging territory, space, material, which are all rooted, they're kind of grounded phenomena, that link between the dominion would be more apparent than the link between the colony, if that makes sense. So I agree with you. I think, you know, decolonization is not exactly the right term, but in the same way that laboratory and workshop are not exactly the right term, it seems to me very much that there's a language here, both materially, formally, spatially, in terms of capital, that's waiting to be born, and all the ingredients are here for it. It's now a question, I think, of testing which are the ingredients that you can bring in to build something and which are the ingredients that you leave behind. I don't know if that answers exactly. Yeah. So I know we had one more question, and okay, 1, 2, and then basta. Basta così. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to Leslie for creating a space for allowing us just to be. Yes. And this question not only goes to the panelists, but yourself, Leslie. I want to talk about responsibility. You spoke, one of the themes here are the youth and your responsibility. I have an architecture friend who said growing up, he romanticized buildings in the West and didn't have anything in Africa to really look at. No symbols to be inspirational, to look at, and to want to build to the future. I want to ask the panelists how you feel about the responsibility of inspiring a younger generation and using your influence to create those symbols so that in 30 years, we don't have to have a panel like this and we can just be.
Who wants to take it?
Okay. Well, I think that responsibility is really key. With my partner, we often think about what is the future of our office? How do we sort of pass it on to the younger generation? And for us, it's also very important that that younger generation understands their responsibility. I think knowing that today the sort of task of the architect goes beyond building a house or building what have you, we also have the responsibility to sort of teach that younger generation that they need to think about larger questions than those related directly to building. For instance, looking at the society we live in, knowing that what we are going through today is the result of what happened during the 20th century. When we know that many centuries, have been before the 20th century. And I think it should be quite easy to sort of break those boundaries and go look what happened before, to sort of better understand who we are and not think that we are just the product of the 20th century. And I think as a responsibility for the younger generation, it's very, very important to also look at those aspects that have nothing to do with the direct practice of architecture, but the entire world in which we live, and how do we position ourselves, with regards to all those different dynamics, whether they're economical, whether they're sustainable. Sustainability today is a big question. I mean, we should have no shame to look at our villages and see how sustainable they are. These are questions that I think are, at the core of what the next generation should be sort of working on and thinking about.
I want to add to that. I just want to add to that, maybe in an emotional direction, that I think it's also important to give the next generation confidence to help with that, because often you have things in your head that are absolutely crazy. You're like, should I tell somebody that? Should I make this thing? Should I actually try to invent that? Yes, you should, and that should be given. People should be given the opportunity to have that space, and I think it's a very difficult space to find often, especially for students of color in the United States and students of color, globally. So I think that I wanted to just say something about making spaces where people could bring and throw down their imagination and be encouraged to follow the things that are kind of crazy, the things that don't make sense, and move forward with those.
I was just going to piggyback on the word that caught my attention you use right now is the word shame. When you said there should be no shame, and that is a very telling word, and that speaks a lot about the mindset we're in, the frame of the sort of the background chatter that is going on, where again we always feel like we need to justify ourselves, and that you have to explain yourself also if you are showing something that is not, either from the Western world or from sort of this dominion, and that if it's something that is proper to you and local, somehow that needs to be explained and that needs to be justified. And then you have to sort of, not have shame about going and confronting with it, but rather actually started to think of it as something that is of absolute equal value, that exists on the same plane as any other form of architecture, detail, elements, ways of living. And I think the project for us as architects working on the continent is actually really about manifesting that, but a 21st century incarnation of that. So one thing definitely about going back to excavating what has been forgotten, because it's one of the issue is of knowledge access. Who controls that knowledge? Who produces it? Where does that knowledge reside? And how does it get disseminated at the end of the day? A lot of the knowledge related to the architecture that we can draw from that is of the continent is sitting either in a museum somewhere in Europe and America or in a library somewhere in Europe and America. So we are completely dispossessed of that knowledge, number one. Number two, for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to actually access that knowledge, then it is definitely a responsibility to then make that into, imagine the new form that needs to have for today. It's not about romanticizing what it used to be and recreating that, but creating a new reality that has everything to do with who we are today.
Toni Morrison has this wonderful, twist on the word responsibility, and it's responsibility, the ability to provoke a response, and I love that duality. So I'm going to take one more question, which is the lady who's had her hand up for ages, and then we're...
Can you allow me to respond to that?
Okay.
The last one.
Sharp, quick.
Thank you. 3 things. I'll claim no responsibility to provide answers to younger people. I don't think I have any or many questions I will ask. But I will promise this. I will ask constantly each person I meet who's younger than me 2 questions. 1 is, who are you? And 2 is, what are your deepest fears? Because I think in those 2 questions, we reject any answer that I think is in dissonance of what I think is the reality, at least to my experience and my knowledge. Because I think in those 2 questions, we're able to step into an uncomfortable position to go beyond the surface of what we show people we are, and try to find like who we really are and what we fear. And I think in those two questions, if people are able to dig deep down and have people who care about them push them to find those answers, then they can be equipped to find their way around. Otherwise, the identity confusion we have will persist, unfortunately.
Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to say thank you, Leslie. It's a beautiful exhibition. And I'm very happy that came out in this moment that we are living in the world, right? I want to ask you guys basically, how can we break this barrier from like what we need to do, what we want to do, and to become something, like to be seen, like what you're talking about? How can we have the courage to be able to expose our responsibility, to make things happen, to have a voice, to be heard?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry. Can you just, what do you mean?
Like whatever tips you would have to people that are initiating their career as architects. And
How to become famous?
No,
Oh.
no. How to be able to have your voice seen, because things are so hard right now, to be able to be yourself, to be able to have a voice. And do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I'll let somebody.
Of clients, and like when you get a project, for instance, what the first thing you think? You're in fear of expressing yourself, what the clients want you to do, and sometimes we're in the middle of like...
Because of your ideas?
Yeah, if we make a mistake, and sometimes we block ourselves from being, with fear of that
Really?
our voice will be the right one.
I think,
And then we don't become ourselves. That's what...
I think I hear what you're saying. So I think I hear that you are interested in making a space where you can do something different within architecture and be yourself and try new things, do a lab, right? Make a laboratory, make something that someone maybe hasn't seen before. So there's a couple ways of doing that, but I think this depends on where you are in the globe and where you are in life, and how can you afford this, et cetera. But there might be ways of tackling more imaginary projects on the side. You have to have a lot of energy to try things that are the most important things to you, right? And trying to understand how those connect with others. And then there might be the things that you do for a client, right? Which is the thing that the client expects. So there might be many spaces that you actually carry with you as a young practitioner that you use to build up a way of framing something that's larger, that is your own vision. But it takes time because, in fact, yes, you need to support yourself, right? You have to have a job. You have to pay your bills. And so there might be competitions, or you might find a way of building furniture or blowing glass or doing something else that takes you to where you want to be, to get you to where you want to be, right? So a little bit of extra energy in translating those ideas, but it takes time. So that's just one suggestion.
Yeah. Can I add to that you shouldn't be scared of your clients? They want to hear your imagination. And if they don't like it, that's fine. Wait for the client that's going to like your imagination. There is going to be a client that will like your imagination. That's the one thing I can tell you about the difficult trajectory of practice. There are many people who will say no, but there will be people who will turn up and say yes.
Yeah, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to understand.
Fear.
You want fear. You want to feel that. That's great. That's courage. And so that's the hard part. People think to be courageous is, oh, fear has gone away. But when you stop feeling the uncomfortability, that's when you start losing the courage and knowing the consequence. I always think back to, when I was small, my father would always say, if someone bothers your sisters, help them, right? And I was fearful of fighting. But once I got into a fight to help my sisters and I saw the consequence, it didn't kill me, it made me courageous, but I was still scared, right? And you can carry that into a room. You still feel the fear, but you should know the outcome. Like David says, sometimes you won't get the job, but it's not going to kill you, right? And so that's just to go forward.
Yeah, I think this morning in the award ceremony, Dar made a very powerful point, which is that you look for cracks in the edifice, and it's in the cracks that you make space, you grow, you find your own voice, and in the end, I think especially in architecture, it boils down to the work. If the work isn't there, no matter what you say about it, it's not going to carry it. So find space, courage to do the work is what I'd say. I sound like an old lady, but yeah, okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. This was, thank you.